just like it's never good that religions are. Well, we all know what has been done in the name of religion. So
yeah, that's right.
So yeah, the rotten apples sometimes seem to be a bigger group than the rest, you know.
Yeah, and here's another thing where you have dualism going on in one person's mind. Here's an example. There were a couple of scientists at one firm that manipulated some data regarding climate change, and super conservative organizations jumped on that to say, see, you can't believe any of it. Well, the same people like me that were bothered by that should also be bothered when a religious leader rises up and then does something illegal or immoral, and they toss the entire religion away. The bad apple argument, like you're saying, a fair-minded person will say, look, that was only a couple of guys. I can still look at the bulk of behavior under the bell curve of this particular separation we're making here, religion or science, and I can get a feeling for meaning that these two bad apples are not going to ruin for me. I'm not going to let them. And I see hardcore scientists, super duper skeptics, as being way too narrow in their focus. I mean, saying that 96% of the universe is dark matter, whatever the percentages they use, is like saying, well, here's what we know about the ocean, it's wet. Well, there's a little bit more to it than that, and we have to get into that. So you can't say the ocean is wet, and that's all you should take away from this. What you can say is one trait we know about the ocean is that it's wet. Now let's get into the rest. Now, the average scientist, in my mind, does think like that. They stay open, but they're not going to commit anything to the I know this bank until they've seen it run through some test of scrutiny. Whereas the hardcore skeptic is like, screw you, this is all false. You know, like Dr. Michael Shermer, he doesn't believe anything about anything that hasn't been proven in a lab. That's a very narrow-minded way to look at the world, if you ask me. It's very exclusive.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think it's the way I look at this is that, for example, a lot of things that science claims really has no effect on me as an individual, you know. So
sure.
A lot of things that are based on data and are kind of thrown at you that this is the way you have to act without considering your personal life and your personal surroundings. And I think that's confusing people a bit, and even sometimes making people make the wrong decisions, you know. Mm-hmm. And climate change is another thing that I don't necessarily believe that climate change is man-made. I think we talked about this before.
Yes.
But to say that everything is bullshit, like the conservatives do indeed, I can't stand when they take this position, because they're pretty much throwing the whole environmental issue overboard with it. Just because even if climate change wasn't happening, we're still polluting the earth, and they just throw that overboard because, I'd say because it's convenient for them.
Yeah. Well, see, the political right in America tends to serve, among other things, big business interests. And what big business does not want is a regulating body to come in and say, guess what, you've got to follow some rules here because we'd rather you not poison our rivers and our air, kind of important to us. And the other thought in that same ballpark is, well, we're too small. Human beings are just little tiny dots on the face of the earth. We can't make a difference. We're not going to hurt the earth. We might not hurt the earth too bad, but we can hurt ourselves because we can destroy our environment, just like you said. And even if it isn't man-made, which isn't something I've ever argued for climate change, it's not really important to me whether or not it's man-made, but it does mean that we can do something about keeping the carbon count down. And we know we can. So I don't see what's so crazy about wanting to keep the carbon count down to a manageable level, since it's having such a huge effect across the planet.
But I can understand the problem the right has with that, because they feel like if you call climate change man-made and make people feel guilty, you kind of legitimize yourself for taxing all kinds of things, which... I mean, taxes is something the right doesn't like to begin with, so right. I can get that stance. That's for me, that's understandable. But it's very hard for people to understand these big things.
Yeah.
Just based on opinions of others. I mean, in the end, I always say that it's a matter of believing. So it doesn't really matter what kind of belief you follow. It's still a belief.
Well, if you could change the way people think today across the globe, what would you change about it? Where are people making their mistakes in thinking?
Oh man, I wouldn't know where to begin, because that's the thing. Whatever argument you put forward, you're always going to get a reply which needs another solution, and that will leave you with a set of solution, maybe 10 or 15, that would have to be the base of everything. It's hard. I mean, I think it will take a lot of sacrificing from people that are well off right now to make everything better. That's one of the things that I think is really important. Did you ever get to the video of the guerrilla gardener?
No, I haven't seen it yet. I got it bookmarked, but I haven't seen it yet.
Yeah. Well, there's something that I think that's going to be really, really important, that people will take matters in their own hand again and start being responsible for their own food. I think it will be necessary.
Yeah, he's talking about basically local farming, which I think there's a huge movement on for now, and I hope it does take off, because people need to realize that if shipping breaks down, if you're living in a civilized society right now where you get your food at a grocery, if shipping breaks down for any reason, you're screwed. And that could come from so many causes: natural disasters, man-made disasters. You need to be able to go to local sources for your food, but that includes a lot of other things. You don't want to be driving 2-3 hours to get to a doctor if you can avoid it. Go to local, there needs to be local support. But here's the thing: if we get all this local support in place, there will be a population boom, because now people that were starving or otherwise sick and dying off are breeding. So once the population really ramps up, we're going to run into a freshwater problem. We're going to run into a space problem. We're going to run into food shortage problems, because the technology hasn't kept up with the population as far as food production. And we're going to continue to have refugee problems from war-torn areas, from climate refugees fleeing from the water line as the water level rises, which it is. And what are we going to do when population itself becomes a huge part of our problem?
Well, if you I would say, if I look at a small country like Holland, I know it's not maybe not representative of the whole world, but if you see how people stockpile in cities, if you would at least get people spread over the land in a normal way, I think you could house a lot more people in areas where you're well off,
Yeah.
And I mean, a good example of the idiocy of things here now is that we got the Dutch and French people, fishermen, who will catch their shrimp here in the North Sea, then they fly them over to Morocco, and that is the place where they are peeled, because it's less expensive to fly them over to Morocco and let the cheap labor help them out, and then fly it back. So you kind of got a down spiral of who can offer the cheapest labor in the world, which is something that you would take away if you go back to local. You'd solve a whole other bunch of problems by just fixing things locally.
Yeah.
And it's things that will cost money. I mean, it's not normal for shrimps to fly to Morocco and get peeled over there. I mean,
yeah.
I'd use logical thinking there to say that's not the way it should be done.
Well, we're heading right now for an even bigger problem regarding local food production and other local things because of drone technology, which is going to deliver anywhere for ridiculously cheap amount of, expenditure. And that's going to get people even more dependent upon shipping. And if shipping fails for any reason, there's going to be a huge problem. I mean, it's right now it would be big, but if we let it go on where drones can deliver a simple coffee, a simple bottle of water to you out in the middle of wherever, you're going to completely forget about local production of anything because shipping will become so
cheap,
universal,
Yeah, and cheap. I mean, if they start mass producing these things, it's going to be cheap as hell. But that's the thing. People will need to start thinking, and that's why we need to educate children about that it's not just money. Money is like the underlying problem. The same thing, we were talking about wars earlier. I think it was before you. I think Barclay asked you a bit about wars, and if you think about every reason that exists why wars start in the first place, are problems we need to get rid of. And I think the power and money are two huge things that cause problems, which you wouldn't have if there was no money and no power to begin with.
Yeah. Well, the problems that create wars, I don't think will ever go away as long as human beings can be offended. I think that's going to be, until we get past that, war will be forever. I mean, this globalization that we're seeing now of global economy and possibly global rule structure as we get these international criminal courts, a lot of people are terrified of this, but it's really no different than in America, 13 colonies. There were 13 colonies. They were entirely independent. Yeah, and the next thing you know, they united and became one country. And everybody pushed back against it, but was it that bad? What happened?
The war, if you talk about war that is caused by people being offended, how many people would get into an argument if you had no power? Without power, there wouldn't be any nations, there wouldn't be any cities or states or big groups. Why would you organize in a bigger group if you can do anything? If you got everything, at a certain point, you're going to stop growing your group. You're going to go with whatever works.
Yeah, it's a good point. We're talking about thinking today. You're listening to RD, the Dutchman, and K-Tap, the American. And we're talking about thinking and philosophy. And I'm looking at a quote right now from Socrates, who said that there is only one good, knowledge, and one evil, ignorance. But if knowledge, he's not said that was the end of his quote, and I'm adding, if knowledge is debatable as to what is valid and what is not valid, well then how can we move at all? Terrance McKenna says we have to. We have to start telling bad ideas when they're bad and supporting good ideas when they're good. But how can you know? How can you really know?
Yeah, you can't.
So it almost makes progress look impossible.
Well, it's very hard to imagine an objective truth when it's always coming from somebody, Yeah. That's the hard part. You can only kind of think of it as the McKenna talks, like an ink blot, that everybody, if truth is indeed something that everybody can pretty much paint anything on that he thinks, it's going to be really hard to come up with like a common definition of the truth. Maybe it's designed so everybody can have their own truth, and maybe small groups can have their own truth and follow their own rules.
So maybe there are no universal truths, you're saying.
Well, everybody knows that the more people you get involved in a discussion, the harder it will be to reach an agreement. It's pretty hard to be in an agreement with yourself already. So, you talk to yourself all day, and you rarely find yourself agreeing all the time. So, if you are in a relationship of two people, it's already hard, and the more people you add, it will get harder to agree on a common truth. So why make it so difficult for ourselves?
That's a good point. I'm looking at a Terrance McKenna here, which